Sometimes the family you choose finds you when you need it most. Sometimes that family howls at the moon. 63-year-old Eli Hargrove lives alone in the Montana mountains, building his cabin 30 years ago after people broke his trust. One too many times. When he finds 3 orphaned wolf pups beside their dead mother, the townspeople think he's lost his mind. They warn him about keeping wild animals, but Eli knows something about being abandoned. For 5 years, he raises the wolves as his sons, teaching them to hunt and survive. The town calls him crazy, but Eli has found his purpose again. Then Blackstone Industries shows up with mining equipment and legal papers, ready to destroy his mountain home. The corporation thinks they're dealing with one old hermit. They have no idea what happens when you threaten a wolf pack. Could 3 loyal wolves and their human father really stop an entire company from destroying everything they love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Copper Ridge like an old man's beard, soft and gray in the early light. Eli Hargrove stood on his front porch, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the sun paint the Montana peaks in shades of gold and rose. At 63, his body carried the weight of 3 decades in these mountains, shoulders broad but slightly stooped from years of splitting wood, hands scarred from building and rebuilding, beard gone silver white like the frost that kissed his cabin's eaves. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd learned to depend on no one but himself. Every log had been cut and notched by his own hands, every stone in the foundation placed with the careful precision of someone who understood that out here, mistakes could mean death. The structure sat like a natural growth among the pines, weathered gray wood blending seamlessly with the granite outcroppings that jutted from the mountain's face. 30 years ago, Eli had arrived here with little more than an old pickup truck, a few tools, and a heart full of bitter disappointment. He'd been younger then, still believing in the goodness of people, still trusting that loyalty meant something. That was before the Blackwater incident, before his military unit had been sacrificed by politicians who cared more about their careers than the lives of good soldiers. Before his commanding officer had sold out 12 men to cover up a weapons deal gone wrong. Before Eli had watched his best friend die in his arms, while their own government denied they'd ever existed. The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical wound. He'd left the service, left the city, left everything that reminded him of broken promises and corrupted trust. These mountains had offered him something civilization couldn't: honesty. The wilderness didn't lie to you. Winter was cold, summer was hot, and the land demanded respect without offering false friendship in return. For 3 decades, he'd lived by simple rules. Work hard, waste nothing, and trust only what you could see and touch. The nearest neighbor, lived 15 miles down a winding dirt road that became impassable for 4 months each winter. The closest town, Pine Ridge, consisted of a general store, a diner, a gas station, and maybe 200 souls who minded their own business most of the time. Eli preferred it that way. He'd built a life of quiet routines, checking his traps, tending his small vegetable garden, chopping wood for the long winters, and reading by lamplight when the snow piled 6 feet deep against his door. He'd become something of a legend among the locals. The hermit of Copper Ridge, the mountain man who could track a deer for 20 miles and disappear into the forest like smoke. But legends, Eli had learned, were just stories people told to make sense of things they didn't understand. The sound of his 3 companions stirring inside the cabin broke his morning reverie. Through the screen door came the soft padding of enormous paws on wooden floors, followed by the appearance of 3 magnificent gray wolves. Ghost, the largest of the 3, pushed through the door, first 120 pounds of muscle and intelligence, his pale gray coat almost white in the morning light. Shadow followed, darker and more cautious, amber eyes constantly scanning for threats. Finally came Storm, the smallest but fiercest of the three. Her coat a rich silver black that rippled like water when she moved. They weren't pets, despite what the folks in Pine Ridge whispered. They were family, partners, the sons and daughter he'd never had, raised from pups so small they could fit in his coat pocket. "Morning, boys," Eli murmured, running his hand through ghost-thick fur. The wolf leaned against his leg with the easy affection of complete trust. "And you too, little Storm." The female wolf's ears perked at the sound of her name, and she bumped his hand with her massive head. At 4 years old, she was fully grown, but still the baby of their pack, still the one who demanded the most attention and gave the most freely. In return, 5 years ago, if someone had told Eli he'd be sharing his morning coffee with 3 wolves, he'd have recommended they see a doctor. But life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. He'd found them on a bitter February morning, 3 tiny pups no more than a few weeks old, huddled against their mother's lifeless body. A trapper's snare had taken their cruel and efficient, leaving her babies to freeze in the Montana cold. Something in those small, desperate whimpers had cracked open a part of Eli's heart he'd thought was permanently sealed. Maybe it was recognition one, abandoned soul calling to another. Maybe it was simple compassion. Or maybe it was just time for the walls around his heart to come down. He brought them home, fully expecting them to die despite his best efforts. Wolf pups were notoriously difficult to raise, requiring constant care, specialized food, and the kind of round-the-clock attention Eli hadn't given anything in 30 years. But these 3 had been fighters from the start. They'd taken to the bottles of puppy formula he'd driven 60 miles to buy, grown fat and playful in the warmth of his cabin, and bonded to him with the fierce loyalty that only wild things could offer. The people in Pine Ridge had thought he'd lost his mind. Martha Hendricks at the general store had clucked her tongue and warned him about the dangers of keeping wild animals. Tom Bradley at the diner had shaken his head and muttered about mountain fever, the supposed madness that struck hermits who spent too long alone. Even Doc Morrison, who'd patched Eli up after a chainsaw accident 3 winters back, had suggested maybe it was time to consider moving closer to town, where he could have proper human companionship. They didn't understand that proper human companionship was exactly what Eli had been avoiding all these years. People lied. People betrayed. People made promises they had no intention of keeping. The wolves were different. Their loyalty was absolute. Their communication honest and direct. When Ghost was happy, his tail wagged. When Shadow was concerned, his ears stood alert. When Storm was playful, she bounded around the cabin like a puppy despite weighing 90 pounds. There was no deception. In their world, no hidden agendas or political maneuvering. They lived in the present moment, trusting completely or not at all. In many ways, they were better company than most humans Eli had known. The 3 wolves had grown up learning the mountains as Eli had learned them through patience, observation, and respect for the natural order. They could track a deer for miles without making a sound, navigate by scent through blizzards that would blind a man, and communicate with each other through subtle body language that spoke louder than words. But they'd also learned things no wild wolf would ever know. How to open the cabin door by working together. How to signal when they wanted to go hunting versus when they just wanted to patrol their territory. And how to share Eli's evening meals without fighting among themselves. They become a pack in the truest sense. Not just Eli and 3 wolves, but 4 beings who understood their roles and responsibilities to each other without question. Ghost was the natural leader, calm and decisive. Shadow was the scout, always ranging ahead to check for dangers. Storm was the heart of their family, the one who kept them connected through play and affection. And Eli was their anchor, the one who provided stability and wisdom when the world outside their mountain became threatening, and threatening it had become. though Eli hadn't realized it yet as he stood on his porch that morning, watching his wolves sniff the air with the casual alertness of creatures perfectly at home in their world. The mountains held their secrets close, but change was coming to Copper Ridge, whether Eli wanted it or not. Down in Pine Ridge, strangers in expensive suits had been asking questions. Maps had been spread across tables in the town hall, marked with boundaries and mineral rights that most of the locals didn't fully understand. Phone calls had been made to Helena and Washington, conversations conducted in the careful language of lawyers and corporate executives who saw the land not as a living thing, but as a resource to be extracted and processed and sold. But Eli knew none of this as he finished his coffee and prepared for another day of the quiet routine that had sustained him for 30 years. He didn't know that his name was on a list in a filing cabinet 3 states away, marked as a land use obstacle that would need to be addressed before operations could begin. He didn't know that the life he'd built with such careful solitude was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. All he knew was that the morning was beautiful. His wolves were healthy and content, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle was calling to its mate from a thermal rising off the valley floor. For Eli Hargrove, hermit of Copper Ridge, it seemed like just another perfect day in the wilderness he'd claimed as home. He had no idea how wrong he was. Asterisk. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in September, delivered by a nervous-looking young man in a Ford pickup who kept glancing at the 3 wolves lounging in the afternoon shade. Eli had been splitting wood when he heard the truck's engine laboring up the steep grade of his access road, a sound that immediately put him on alert, since unexpected visitors were about as common as blizzards in July. Asterisk Ghost's ears had pricked forward at the first sound of the engine, and all 3 wolves had risen from their resting spots to flank Eli as he set down his axe and waited. The young man, barely out of his teens by the look of him, climbed out of the truck with the careful movements of someone who'd been warned about what he might encounter up here. "Mr. Hargrove?" the kid called out, staying close to his vehicle. "I'm Jake Morrison from Hartwell Legal Services down in Helena. I have some documents that need to be served to you personally." Eli walked slowly toward the truck, his wolves matching his pace. The kid's eyes never left the wolves, and Eli could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "Legal documents?" Eli kept his voice calm, though something cold was starting to settle in his stomach. In 30 years on this mountain, he'd never received anything that required a process server. "Yes, sir. Just need you to sign acknowledging." "Receipt." Jake held out a manila envelope with hands that shook slightly. "And, maybe you could ask your dogs to back up a bit." "They're not dogs," Eli said quietly, accepting the envelope. "And they're fine where they are." The signature took less than 30 seconds. Jake was back in his truck and heading down the mountain before Eli had even opened the envelope. Smart kid. Inside were 3 separate documents, each bearing the letterhead of different law firms and corporations. The first was from Blackstone Industries, a name Eli didn't recognize but instinctively distrusted. The letter was written in the careful, bloodless language of corporate lawyers, but its meaning was clear enough. Blackstone had purchased the mineral rights to several thousand acres surrounding Eli's property. They were providing notice of their intention to conduct geological surveys and, pending the results, begin mining operations within the next 60 days. The second letter was from the county, informing him that his access road, the narrow dirt track he'd maintained for 3 decades, was being redesignated as a service road for industrial use. Heavy equipment would be traversing it regularly, and he would need to coordinate his personal use with the new mining schedule. The third letter was the worst. It was from something called Mountain Property Management, informing him that his homestead, the land he'd bought and paid for, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, was now classified as being within the safety perimeter of active mining operations. For his own protection, they were prepared to offer him fair market value for his property, plus relocation assistance to help him find suitable housing closer to town amenities, and medical facilities appropriate for a man of your age. Eli read all 3 letters twice, his jaw tightening with each carefully crafted phrase. They were stealing his life, wrapping the theft in legal language and corporate concern for his welfare. 30 years of solitude, of building something that belonged entirely to him. And now strangers in suits were telling him it was time to move closer to town for his own good. Storm sensed his agitation first, pressing against his leg with a soft whine. Ghost and Shadow closed ranks, their amber eyes alert and focused on their pack leader. They couldn't read the papers in his hands, but they could read him perfectly. Their human was upset, and that meant potential danger to their Tory. "It's all right," Eli murmured, though his voice carried an edge that made all 3 wolves' ears swivel toward him. "We're not going anywhere." That evening, Eli drove down to Pine Ridge for the first time in 6 months. The Rusty Nail Diner was nearly empty when he pushed through the door, the dinner crowd having long since finished their meals and headed home. Martha Hendricks looked up from behind the counter with surprise. Eli's appearances in town were rare enough to be noteworthy. "Well, I'll be," Martha said, already reaching for the coffee pot. Eli Hargrove in the flesh. "What brings you down from your mountain?" "Need to ask some questions," Eli said, settling onto a stool at the counter. He accepted the coffee gratefully and spread the 3 letters on the worn formica surface. "You know anything about this Blackstone Industries?" Martha's expression darkened as she read. "Oh, honey, I was hoping those letters wouldn't find their way up to you for a while yet." "So you knew?" "Old Town's been talking about nothing else for 2 weeks. They rolled in here with their surveyors and their lawyers, buying up mineral rights from every rancher who was struggling to make ends meet. Offered cash money that most folks couldn't afford to refuse." Eli felt something cold and familiar settling in his chest, the same feeling he'd had in his gut the night before the Blackwater betrayal. How many folks sold? Most of them. The Carson Ranch, the old Peterson place, even the Hendricks spread where my brother used to run cattle. Martha shook her head sadly. "Times have been hard, Eli. Cattle prices haven't been good in 3 years. And the drought last summer took whatever profit was left. These Blackstone people showed up offering more money than most of these families had seen in a decade." "What kind of mining?" "Copper, mostly. Maybe some rare earth minerals, the kind they use in those computer phones everyone's carrying around. Now, they're talking about an open pit operation that'll employ 300 people and run for 20 years. Martha refilled his coffee without being asked. "Course, that means they'll strip mine half the county and turn it into something that looks like the surface of the moon." Eli stared at the letters, his mind working through implications and possibilities. Open pit mining meant they'd scrape away everything: trees, topsoil, wildlife habitat, everything that made the land what it was. His mountain, the territory where he and his wolves had lived in peace for 5 years, would become an industrial wasteland. What about the folks who didn't sell? Martha's expression grew even more troubled. "That's where it gets complicated. Seems like there's some old law from the mining boom days that gives mineral rights holders certain powers when it comes to access and safety. They can force easements, relocate people who are in the way, that sort of thing. Legal, but not exactly friendly. And the county's going along with this?" "County commissioners see dollar signs, Eli. 300 jobs, increased tax revenue, infrastructure improvements. They're calling it an economic development project." Martha leaned across the counter, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But, between you and me, I think there's more to it than that. These Blackstone people have been throwing money around like it grows on trees. New vehicles for the sheriff's department, a generous donation to renovate the town hall, promises of New school and medical clinic. Eli nodded slowly. He'd seen this before, in different countries and under different flags. People with power and money slowly corrupting a system until resistance became impossible. The only difference was that this time they were doing it with lawyers and environmental impact studies instead of guns and threats. How long do I have? According to the notices they posted at Town Hall, surveying starts next week. If they find what they're looking for, and word is they already know they will, construction begins by spring thaw. Martha reached across and touched his weathered hand. I'm sorry, Eli. I know what that place means to you. Eli folded the letters carefully and tucked them into his jacket pocket. What Martha didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that it wasn't just about what the mountain meant to him. It was about what it meant to Ghost, Shadow, and Storm. This was their territory, the only home they'd ever known. Moving them wasn't like relocating a house cat. Wolves were territorial creatures who defined themselves by the land they claimed and defended. And Eli had learned something important during his 5 years with the pack. When your territory is threatened, you don't negotiate. You don't relocate for everyone's convenience. You fight. The drive back up the mountain took him through darkness thick enough to swallow the truck's headlights. But Eli knew every turn, every pothole, every overhanging branch. This was his road, his mountain, his home. And despite what the lawyers and corporate executives thought, he wasn't going anywhere. 3 pairs of glowing eyes watched from the cabin's porch as he pulled up, and Eli felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 30 years. It wasn't quite peace, and it wasn't quite anger. It was something harder and more dangerous. Resolve. The mountain had made him strong. His wolves had made him family. And now, for the first time since the Blackwater betrayal, Eli Hargrove had something worth fighting for again. Asterisk, the surveyors arrived 3 days later, just as the morning mist was lifting from the valley. Eli heard their vehicles long before he saw them, diesel engines struggling up the grade, the clank and rattle of equipment being hauled over rough terrain. He stood on his porch with his coffee, watching through the trees as a convoy of white trucks and ATVs made their way toward his property line. Ghost, Shadow, and Storm had been restless all morning, pacing the cabin's perimeter with the controlled agitation of predators sensing an intrusion. Their territory was being invaded by strangers, and every instinct they possessed was telling them to respond accordingly. Easy, Eli murmured, though he felt the same tension coiling in his own muscles. Let's see what they want first. The lead vehicle stopped at the edge of his property, marked by a line of weathered fence posts and orange survey tape that had been there since he'd bought the land 30 years ago. A man in his 40s climbed out, wearing the kind of outdoor gear that cost more than most people made in a month. Behind him came 2 younger men with expensive cameras and surveying equipment, and a woman in a hard hat who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The older man approached the fence line with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. When he spotted Eli on the porch, he raised a hand in what was probably meant to be a friendly wave. Mr. Hargrove? I'm David Chen, project manager for Blackstone's geological survey team. His voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who spent a lot of time convincing people to do things they didn't want to do. I wanted to introduce myself before we begin our work in the area. Eli set down his coffee cup and walked slowly toward the fence, his 3 wolves flanking him like a living shadow. He could see Chun's expression change as the wolves became visible, the practiced smile faltering slightly around the edges. Those are some impressive dogs, Chun said, though. His voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. They're wolves, Eli corrected quietly. And this is their territory. Right, well. Chen consulted a clipboard, clearly trying to regain his professional composure. According to our mineral rights documentation, We have legal access to conduct geological surveys on the property adjacent to yours. We wanted to make sure you're aware of our activities so there won't be any misunderstandings. What kind of activities? Standard procedure for this type of operation. Soil sampling, core drilling, seismic testing. We'll be working in sections, starting with the area about a quarter-mile north of your property line. Chun gestured toward the ridge where Eli often took his wolves hunting. The work should be completed within 2 to 3 weeks, weather permitting. Eli studied the man's face, reading the careful neutrality that came from years of delivering unwelcome news to people who had no power to stop it. And after the testing, that depends on what we find. If the mineral deposits are commercially viable, Blackstone will begin the permitting process for extraction operations. Chun's tone remained professionally pleasant, but his eyes were watching the wolves with obvious concern. Of course, that's still months down the road. Plenty of time for everyone to adjust to the new situation. Shadow had been growing increasingly agitated during the conversation, his ears flat against his head and his hackles slightly raised. The wolf could sense Eli's tension, and something about the stranger's presence was triggering every territorial instinct in his body. Storm, meanwhile, had positioned herself between Eli and the fence, her amber eyes fixed on Chun with the unwavering focus of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Mr. Chun," Eli said carefully, "I think you should understand something about wolves. They're not like domestic animals. When they claim territory, they defend it. And they don't make exceptions for legal paperwork." Chun swallowed hard, his gaze flickering between Eli's weathered face and the 3 wolves that seemed to be growing larger by the minute. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hargrove?" "No, sir. I'm educating you." Eli's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the words. "These wolves have been running this mountain for 5 years. Every tree, every stream, every game trail is part of their territory now. When your people start drilling and blasting and running heavy equipment through their hunting grounds, they're going to consider that an act of aggression. We have legal rights, so do they. It's called the right of possession by force of nature." Eli gestured toward the vast wilderness stretching away toward the horizon. "You might own the mineral rights, Mr. Chun, but my wolves own everything above ground. And they've never lost a territorial dispute." Chun glanced at his colleagues, who were standing by their vehicles, looking increasingly uncomfortable. The woman in the hard hat was speaking quietly into a satellite phone, probably reporting the conversation to someone higher up the corporate chain. The 2 younger men with the surveying equipment kept glancing at the wolves like they expected an attack at any moment. "Mr. Hargrove, I appreciate your concern for wildlife, but we have a job to do here. Blackstone Industries has invested considerable resources in this project, and we intend to proceed according to our legal rights and environmental permits." "I understand that," Eli replied. "Just like I understand that my wolves don't recognize environmental permits. When they hear explosions and machinery in their hunting grounds, they're going to respond the way wolves have responded to threats for 10,000 years." Storm chose that moment to emit a low rumbling growl, not loud enough to be overtly threatening, but deep enough to make every human present acutely aware that they were standing 30 feet away from 270 pounds of predator. Ghost and Shadow immediately flanked her, their body language shifting from alert observation to active threat assessment. Chun took an involuntary step backward. "I think we're done here for now. But Mr. Hargrove, I want you to understand that Blackstone has dealt with wildlife management issues before. We have protocols in place. I'm sure you do." Eli's smile was thin and cold. "Just make sure your protocols account for the fact that these particular wolves have a human pack leader who spent 20 years learning how to kill people more dangerous than you. The surveying team was packed and gone within 10 minutes. They're convoy disappearing down the mountain road in a cloud of dust and diesel exhaust. Eli stood at his fence line long after the sound of their engines had faded, his hand resting on Ghost's massive head while he considered what had just happened. The corporate executives behind Blackstone had made their first mistake. They'd assumed that because Eli lived alone on a mountain, he was isolated and powerless. They'd failed to understand that isolation wasn't weakness, it was preparation. For 30 years, he'd been learning the mountains, studying every approach and escape route, memorizing every natural defensive position. And for 5 years, he'd been living with partners who understood warfare better than any human ever could. Wolves were pack hunters, ambush predators, who could coordinate complex strategies without speaking a word. They could move through terrain that would stop human soldiers, strike without warning, and disappear into wilderness that would swallow entire armies. The surveyors would be back, probably with security personnel and wildlife management specialists. They'd have tranquilizer guns and federal permits and the backing of corporate lawyers who'd never met a problem they couldn't solve with money and legal pressure. But they'd never dealt with a pack that included a former Special Forces operator who'd spent 3 decades learning to be invisible in terrain they couldn't even navigate. They were about to discover that some problems couldn't be solved with paperwork and corporate intimidation. As Eli headed back toward his cabin, Storm bumped against his leg with the casual affection of a creature absolutely confident in her pack leader's ability to handle any threat. And for the first time in 30 years, Eli felt the familiar weight of command settling across his shoulders like an old coat. The war for Copper Ridge had begun. A first explosion came at dawn 2 days later, a deep rumbling that rolled across the valley like thunder and sent every bird in the forest into panicked flight. Eli felt it in his bones before he heard it, the ground trembling under his feet as he stood at the kitchen window, watching Ghost, Shadow, and Storm react with the instant alertness of creatures whose entire world had just been violated. All 3 wolves were on their feet immediately, hackles raised, heads turning toward the source of the disturbance. Storm began to pace, her agitation clear in every line of her body. Shadow's ears were flat against his skull, and Ghost calm. Steady Ghost was showing his teeth for the first time Eli had ever witnessed. The second explosion followed 30 seconds later, and this time Eli could see the dust cloud rising from beyond the ridge where the surveyors had been working. Seismic testing, Chun had called it. Small controlled blasts designed to map the underground geology. To the corporate engineers, it was just data collection. To 3 wolves who'd spent their entire lives in the profound silence of the wilderness, it was an act of war. Eli pulled on his jacket and stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. His wolves immediately flanked him, their eyes fixed on the distant ridge where stranger sounds continued to violate their territory. The testing would go on for days, maybe weeks. Each explosion would drive them a little further toward the edge, building stress and aggression until something snapped. He'd seen it before in military working dogs, the way constant stress and perceived threats could turn even the most disciplined animal into something unpredictable and dangerous. The difference was that his wolves weren't military assets. They were family, and their reaction to this invasion of their territory was as natural and inevitable as breathing. The phone rang inside the cabin, the sound harsh and intrusive in the morning quiet. Eli considered letting it ring. He received maybe 3 calls a year, usually from well-meaning neighbors checking on him after particularly bad storms. But something made him answer. Eli, Martha Hendrick's voice was tight with worry. You hear those explosions? Hard to miss them. Listen, honey, I'm calling because there's been talk in town. Some of the Blackstone people were in the diner yesterday, asking questions about you and those wolves of yours. Martha paused, and Eli could hear the careful way she was choosing her words. They seemed real interested in what kind of permits you might have for keeping wild animals. Eli felt ice settling in his stomach. What kind of questions? Whether you were licensed as a wildlife rehabilitator, whether the state knew about the wolves, whether there had been any complaints about dangerous animals. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. Eli, I think they're looking for a way to have your wolves removed. It made perfect sense from a corporate perspective. If they couldn't intimidate Eli into selling his property, they'd find another way to neutralize him as an obstacle. 3 wolves represented a public safety concern that would give them all the legal justification they needed. A few phone calls to the right state agencies, maybe some manufactured complaints from concerned citizens, and the wolves would be gone. Problem solved. Thanks for the warning, Martha. Be careful up there. I got a feeling this is about to get a lot more complicated. Eli hung up the phone and stood looking at his 3 companions, who were still agitated by the ongoing explosions. In 5 years, he'd never bothered with permits or licenses for Ghost, Shadow, and Storm. They weren't captive animals being held for exhibition or profit. They were family members who'd chosen to stay with their human pack leader rather than rejoin the wild. But try explaining that to a state wildlife bureaucrat who'd never seen a wolf outside of a zoo. The 3rd explosion was larger than the others, close enough to rattle the cabin windows and send a flock of ravens screaming across the valley. Storm whined and pressed against Eli's leg, seeking reassurance from her pack leader that this invasion of their territory would be dealt with appropriately. I know, girl, Eli murmured, scratching behind her ears. I know it's wrong. We're going to do something about it. But what? He was one man with 3 wolves, facing a corporation with unlimited legal resources and government backing. In a straight fight, he'd lose. In court, he'd lose faster. The only advantage he had was intimate knowledge of terrain that the corporate executives couldn't even pronounce correctly on their geological surveys. That afternoon, Eli took his wolves on a different kind of patrol. Instead of following their usual hunting trails, he led them to observation points that offered clear views of the surveying operation. From a ridge half a mile away, they could see the Blackstone crews working with controlled efficiency drilling. Core samples, setting off small charges, taking measurements that would determine the fate of thousands of acres of wilderness. Those seemed to understand that this was reconnaissance rather than hunting. The big wolf settled beside Eli with the patient alertness of a sniper waiting for a target. Shadow and Storm took positions on either flank, their eyes constantly scanning for threats or opportunities. They were learning to see their territory through their pack leader's eyes, not just as hunting grounds, but as a battlefield that would require strategy and coordination to defend. The Blackstone operation was impressive in its scope and organization. They had satellite communications, GPS mapping systems, and enough equipment to supply a small army. But they also had vulnerabilities that became obvious once you knew what to look for. Their vehicles were expensive and delicate, designed for highway travel rather than wilderness conditions. Their personnel were city people wearing expensive outdoor gear, but moving through the forest with the loud, clumsy confidence of tourists. And their entire operation depended on a single narrow access road that wound through 10 miles of wilderness before reaching the main highway. That evening, Eli spread topographical maps across his kitchen table and began planning with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 20 years learning how small, mobile forces could defeat larger, more conventional enemies. The key was never to fight on the enemy's terms. Instead, you forced them to fight on yours in terrain you knew better, using tactics they couldn't counter with superior resources. The wolves watched him work, their intelligent eyes following his movements as he traced routes and marked positions. On the maps, they couldn't understand the symbols and elevation lines, but they could sense their pack leaders' growing focus and determination. Something important was being planned, and they would be ready when the time came to act. Outside, another explosion echoed across the valley, the sound fading into the vast silence of the mountains. But this time, Eli smiled as he listened to it. Each blast was telling him exactly where his enemies would be, when they would be vulnerable, and how they could be stopped. The corporate executives at Blackstone Industries had made their second mistake. They'd assumed that superior resources guaranteed victory. They were about to learn that in the wilderness, intelligence and adaptation were worth more than all the money in the world. Asterisk. The state wildlife officers arrived on a cold October morning, their green trucks winding up the mountain road with the deliberate pace of people who expected trouble. Eli watched them through binoculars from a concealed position a quarter-mile from his cabin. Ghost lying motionless beside him while Shadow and Storm waited in predetermined positions along the approach route. He'd been expecting this visit ever since Martha's warning about the questions Blackstone had been asking in town. What he hadn't expected was the size of the response team, 3 trucks carrying at least 8 officers, plus what looked like a veterinarian's van and a trailer that probably contained tranquilizer equipment. Someone had convinced the state that he was harboring dangerous predators that posed an imminent threat to public safety. The lead truck stopped at his front gate, and Eli recognized the officer who climbed out, Tom Bradley's nephew, Kevin, who'd grown up in Pine Ridge before joining the state wildlife department. A good kid, but young enough to still believe that following orders and enforcing regulations would always lead to the right outcome. "Mr. Hargrove?" Kevin called toward the cabin, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his shoulder. "This is Officer Bradley with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. We need to speak with you about reports of unlicensed wildlife on your property." Eli stayed hidden, watching as the other officers spread out in a loose perimeter around his cabin. They were being professional about it, but they were also treating the situation like a dangerous animal removal rather than a conversation with a property owner. Someone had briefed them well about what they might encounter. After 5 minutes with no response, Kevin tried again. "Mr. Hargrove, we have reports that you're keeping wolves without proper permits. We're here to verify the animal's status and ensure they're being cared for appropriately. If you cooperate with our investigation, we can work together to resolve any permit issues." The lies came so easily that Eli almost admired the skill involved. There were no permit issues to resolve, because wolves that chose to stay with humans weren't legally required to have permits. And the reports of dangerous animals had obviously come from Blackstone Industries rather than concerned citizens. But Kevin was young enough to believe in the system, and the other officers were just following their orders. From his concealed position, Eli could see the tactical problem clearly. If he revealed himself now, the officers would demand to see the wolves, and the situation would escalate quickly. Ghost, Shadow, and Storm would appear dangerous to people who didn't understand their body language and behavior. Tranquilizer guns would come out, and his family would be caged and transported to some wildlife facility where they'd either die in captivity or be destroyed as dangerous animals. But if he stayed hidden, the officers would eventually enter his cabin looking for evidence, and the wolves would defend their territory against uniformed strangers. That would end with dead wolves and possibly dead officers, an outcome that would destroy everything Eli had built while giving Blackstone exactly what they wanted. The solution came to him with the clarity of a tactical decision made under fire. He couldn't win this confrontation directly, but he could control how it played out. Eli keyed his radio, a handheld unit he'd bought years ago, for emergency communication, and transmitted on the emergency frequency. He knew the officers would be monitoring. "This is Eli Hargrove," he said quietly into the radio. "I'm currently observing your operation from a concealed position, approximately 400 meters northeast of my cabin. I'm unarmed and willing to cooperate, but I need to explain the situation before anyone gets hurt." The response was immediate. Kevin's voice crackled through the radio with professional calm. though Eli could hear the tension underneath. "Mr. Hargrove, we need you to come out in the open with your hands visible. We're here to conduct a routine investigation." "I understand that, Officer Bradley. But you need to understand that my wolves are not pets or captive animals. They're free-ranging predators who've chosen to live with me as part of their pack. If your people enter their territory without my presence, they're going to defend it." There was a long pause before Kevin responded. "Mr. Hargrove, we have legal authority to investigate reports of dangerous wildlife. We're prepared to handle any situation that might arise." "I'm sure you are," Eli replied. "But are you prepared to explain to Tom Bradley why his nephew shot 3 wolves that were legally free to live wherever they chose? Because that's what's going to happen if this goes wrong." Another pause, longer this time. Eli could see Kevin speaking with the senior officer, probably trying to balance his orders against the increasingly complex reality of the situation. Meanwhile, the other officers were growing more nervous as they realized they were being watched by someone they couldn't see. "Mr. Hargrove, we need to resolve this situation. Will you come down and speak with us?" "I'm coming down now," Eli replied. "But I want you to understand something first. These wolves have been living freely on this mountain for 5 years. They're not attacking people or livestock. They're not causing problems for anyone except corporate executives who want to strip mine their territory. If you remove them from their home, you're not protecting public safety. You're eliminating obstacles to corporate profit." Eli emerged from the tree line with his hands clearly visible, walking slowly toward the cluster of vehicles. He'd left his wolves in position, with hand signals they've learned over years of hunting together. They would stay hidden unless the situation deteriorated beyond his ability to control it. Kevin Bradley was a younger version of his uncle, honest, straightforward, and genuinely concerned about doing the right thing. But he was also wearing the uniform of an agency that could be influenced by political pressure and corporate donations. "Mr. Hargrove," Kevin said as Eli approached, "we've received reports that you're keeping wolves without proper permits. We need to verify their welfare and ensure they're not a threat to public safety." "What reports?" Eli asked quietly. "From whom?" Kevin consulted his clipboard, though Eli could see he was uncomfortable with the question. The reports came through proper channels. Citizens expressing concern about dangerous predators in the area. "Citizens," Eli repeated, "or employees of Blackstone Industries." The senior officer, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd probably seen enough politics to recognize it when it bid him step forward. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm Sergeant Martinez. Regardless of who filed the reports, we have a legal obligation to investigate. Can you show us these wolves and provide documentation of their status?" Eli studied Martinez's face and saw something he could work with: skepticism about the situation and annoyance at being used as a corporate enforcement tool. "Sergeant, before I call my wolves, I want you to understand something about pack behavior. These animals will respond to perceived threats against their territory and pack leader. If your officers draw weapons or make aggressive movements, people are going to get hurt." "Are you threatening law enforcement officers?" "No, sir. I'm explaining wolf behavior to prevent a tragedy." Eli's voice remained calm and respectful. "I'm former military, Sergeant. 20 years Special Forces. I know the difference between a threat and an educational briefing." Martinez's expression shifted slightly, the look of one veteran recognizing another. "What unit?" "7th Group. Did 3 tours before Blackwater, 4 after. Afghanistan? And other places that don't officially exist." Eli met the sergeant's eyes directly. "I'm not looking for trouble, Sergeant. But I'm not going to let corporate lawyers use your badge to solve their public relations problem." Martinez was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing factors that went beyond the simple animal control call he probably expected. Finally, He nodded. "Show us the wolves, Mr. Hargrove, but slowly and with plenty of explanation about what we're seeing." Eli raised his hand and gave a subtle gesture toward the tree line. "Ghost, come." The big gray wolf materialized from the forest like smoke, moving with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly at home in its environment. He approached Eli with relaxed confidence, bumping his massive head against his pack leader's hand before sitting calmly at his side. Several of the officers instinctively reached for their weapons, but Martinez held up a restraining hand. "Easy," he said quietly. "Let's see how this plays out." Eli scratched behind Ghost's ears, and the wolf's tail wagged slightly, a gesture of contentment that was impossible to misinterpret as aggression. "This is Ghost," Eli said quietly. "He's been with me for 5 years, since he was 6 weeks old. Watch his body language. Relaxed ears, soft eyes, loose posture. This is what a content, non-aggressive wolf looks like." The transformation in the officers' attitudes was visible. Instead of seeing a dangerous predator, they were watching an interaction that looked remarkably similar to a man with his dog. The wolf was clearly comfortable with humans, showing none of the fear or aggression they'd been warned to expect. Sergeant Martinez stepped closer, his experienced eyes studying Ghost with the careful attention of someone who dealt with genuinely dangerous animals before. "He's impressive," Martinez admitted quietly. "How big?" "About 120 pounds. Shadow and Storm are smaller, but not by much." Eli kept his voice calm and educational, the tone of someone sharing expertise rather than defending his actions. "They're not pets, Sergeant. They're family members who chose to stay with me instead of rejoining wild packs." "Chose?" Officer Bradley looked skeptical. "Wolves don't choose to live with humans. These 3 do." Eli gestured for Shadow to join them, and the darker wolf emerged from his concealment with the same fluid grace as Ghost. "I found them as 6-week-old pups beside their dead mother. Raised them by hand, taught them to hunt, but never restricted their movement. They're free to leave anytime they want. They stay because this is their territory and I'm their pack leader." Shadow approached more cautiously than Ghost, his amber eyes scanning the group of uniformed strangers before accepting Eli's touch. The wolf's body language was alert but not aggressive, the posture of a creature evaluating potential threats without assuming hostile intent. Martinez watched the interaction with growing understanding. Military working dogs? Similar relationship? Different species. Eli scratched Shadow's neck, and the wolf leaned into the contact with obvious trust. These wolves understand pack hierarchy, territorial boundaries, and cooperative hunting strategies better than any human ever could. They're not dangerous to people unless people become dangerous to them. What about livestock? Other wildlife? They hunt elk, deer, and smaller game within their natural territory. No livestock attacks because there's no livestock up here for them to attack. They avoid humans, except for the occasional hiker who gets too close to their den sites during breeding season. Eli's explanation was matter-of-fact, covering the concerns he knew law enforcement would have. In 5 years, there have been no incidents, no complaints from neighbors, and no conflicts with other wildlife. Kevin Bradley was consulting his paperwork again, clearly struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd been told to expect. "Mr. Hargrove, the reports we received indicated these animals posed an imminent threat to public safety. Based on what evidence?" Eli asked quietly. "Concerns raised by area residents about aggressive behavior, potential attacks on livestock." "Officer." "Bradley," Martinez interrupted. "What area residents?" "The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away, and there's no livestock within 30 miles of this location." Kevin's discomfort was obvious as he flipped through his files. The reports came through proper channels. The reports came from Blackstone Industries, Eli said firmly. "They want my wolves removed because they're an obstacle to mining operations. Someone in Helena got a phone call from someone with enough influence to mobilize a state response team. And you're the ones who have to carry out orders that don't make sense. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, his experienced eyes moving between Eli, the wolves, and the paperwork that had brought them here. Finally, he nodded slowly. Call the third one. Eli whistled softly, and Storm emerged from the tree line with the boundless energy that had earned her name. She bounded toward the group like an overgrown puppy, her tail wagging and her entire body expressing joy at being included in whatever her pack leader was doing. The effect on the officers was immediate and decisive. Storm's exuberant greeting bumping against Eli's legs, soliciting attention from Ghost and Shadow, even approaching the uniformed strangers with curious friendliness, made it impossible to see her as a dangerous predator. She was clearly a social animal who viewed humans as part of her extended pack rather than as threats or prey. Jesus, one of the younger officers muttered. She's like a giant puppy. That's exactly what she is, Eli agreed. A 90-pound puppy who happens to be one of the most efficient predators on the continent. But predators who see humans as pack mates don't attack humans. It's not in their behavioral repertoire. Martinez handed his clipboard to Kevin and approached Storm slowly, extending his hand for her to sniff. The wolf investigated his scent with obvious curiosity, then bumped his hand with her massive head in a clear request for attention. Well, I'll be damned, Martinez murmured, scratching behind Storm's ears. How long since they've had contact with strangers? You're the first people other than me they've interacted with in 2 years, Eli replied. Before that, occasional encounters with hikers or hunters passing through their territory always ended peacefully. No permits required for animals that remain free-ranging, Martinez said, more to himself than to the others. No violations of state wildlife law if they're not being held in captivity. He looked up at Eli with the expression of someone who'd figured out he'd been manipulated. Someone wasted a lot of state resources on a non-existent problem. Kevin Bradley was still trying to process the disconnect between his orders and the reality of what they'd found. Sergeant, what do we tell Helena? We tell them the truth. 3 wolves living freely on private property. No evidence of aggressive behavior. No threat to public safety, and no violations of state wildlife regulations. Martinez's voice carried the edge of someone who didn't appreciate being used as a corporate enforcement tool. We also tell them that whoever filed these reports provided false information that wasted taxpayer resources. Eli felt relief settling his chest, but he knew the victory was temporary. Blackstone Industries wouldn't give up after one failed attempt to remove his wolves. They'd find another approach, probably more direct and certainly more dangerous. Sergeant, Eli said quietly, I want you to understand something about the people who arranged this visit. They're not concerned about public safety or wildlife management. They want to strip mine this mountain, and my wolves represent an obstacle to their plans. When this approach fails, they'll try something else. Martinez nodded grimly. Corporate pressure on state agencies isn't exactly uncommon. But next time, maybe they'll think twice before filing false reports with law enforcement. As the wildlife officers packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Martinez approached Eli privately. Mr. Hargrove, you handled this situation well. But you should know that corporate influence in Helena runs deep. If Blackstone really wants your wolves gone, they'll find another way. I know, Eli replied, but they'll discover that removing wolves from their territory isn't as simple as filing paperwork and making phone calls. Be careful how far you push this. The law can protect you up to a point, but it can also be used against you if you're not smart about it. 20 years in special forces taught me a lot about being smart, Sergeant. These mountains taught me the rest. Martinez smiled grimly and handed Eli a business card. If you need someone who understands the difference between Legitimate law enforcement and corporate manipulation. Call me directly. As the convoy of state vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, Eli stood with his 3 wolves and felt the weight of what had just happened. They'd won this round, but the war was far from over. Blackstone Industries now knew that legal pressure and bureaucratic manipulation wouldn't be enough to remove the obstacles to their mining operation, which meant they'd move to more direct methods that would put Ghost, Shadow, and Storm in mortal danger. Storm pressed against his leg with a contented whine, and Eli scratched behind her ears while his mind began working through the tactical implications of what would come next. The corporate executives in their distant offices had no idea what they were about to unleash. They thought they were dealing with one old hermit and 3 wild animals. They were about to discover they were facing a pack that had been preparing for war for 5 years. Asterisk, the hunters arrived 3 weeks later, just before dawn on the 1st day of November. Eli heard their vehicles long before he saw them. diesel engines and the distinctive whine of a TVs echoing off the valley walls. But these weren't Blackstone surveyors or state wildlife officers. These were professionals moving with the predatory silence of people who killed for a living. Ghost sensed the danger first, his massive head lifting from sleep with the instant alertness of a creature whose survival depended on reading subtle threats. Shadow and Storm were awake immediately after, their amber eyes reflecting the dying embers of the cabin's fire as they registered their pack leader's tension. Through the cabin window, Eli could see muzzle flashes in the pre-dawn darkness, not the controlled illumination of equipment lighting, but the brief, harsh strobes of high-powered hunting rifles. Someone was shooting, and they weren't aiming at deer. The first bullet shattered the window beside Eli's head, sending glass fragments across the kitchen floor where Storm had been lying seconds before. Military-grade ammunition, fired from a precision rifle at long range. Someone was trying to kill him, and they knew exactly where to aim in the dark. "Down!" Eli commanded, and all 3 wolves dropped to the floor with trained efficiency. He'd spent years teaching them to respond to hand signals and voice commands, never imagining he'd need them to understand combat orders. But wolves were natural soldiers, and they'd learned to trust their pack leader's tactical decisions without question. The second shot punched through the cabin's log wall, 6 inches from the first, confirming what Eli already knew. The shooter had night vision equipment and a detailed knowledge of the cabin's layout. This wasn't random violence or hunting season confusion. This was a professional assassination attempt, carefully planned and expertly executed. Eli belly-crawled across the floor to his gun safe, his mind automatically cataloging options and obstacles. 20 years of combat experience kicked in like muscle memory, overlaying the panic of civilian life with the cold calculation of a soldier under fire. He had defensive positions, escape routes, and enough firepower to hold off a small army. But he also had 3 wolves to protect, and they were his primary concern. The third shot hit the propane tank outside the cabin, and Eli heard the distinctive hiss of escaping gas. They weren't just trying to kill him, they were trying to destroy all evidence of what they'd done. A propane explosion would level the cabin and incinerate anything inside, making it look like a tragic accident rather than murder. Ghost was watching him with the unwavering focus of a soldier awaiting orders. Shadow and Storm flanked the big wolf, their body language tense but controlled. They could sense the mortal danger surrounding their territory, that they trusted their pack leader to guide them through it. Eli grabbed his rifle and a tactical vest, then led his wolves toward the cabin's back door. The shooters would expect him to try the front entrance or the window's standard escape routes that could be easily covered by sniper fire. But he built this cabin with combat in mind, including a concealed exit that opened into a natural depression behind the structure. The fourth shot hit the propane tank again, and this time Eli heard the sharp crack of metal failure. They had maybe 30 seconds before the gas reached an ignition source and turned his home into a crematorium. "Move," he whispered, and his wolves followed him through the hidden door into the cold mountain air. They were 20 yards from the cabin when the explosion lit up the valley like a miniature sun, the blast wave knocking all four of them flat against the rocky ground. Heat washed over them in a wave that singed the fur on the wolves' backs and left Eli's ears ringing. His home of 30 years, every memory, every possession, every trace of the life he built was gone in an instant. But through the ringing in his ears, Eli could hear something that made his blood run cold. Voices calling to each other in the darkness. Professional voices using military terminology and tactical coordination. The explosion had been a signal, not the end of the attack. They were moving in to confirm the kill. "Contact. 12 o'clock. 200 meters," one voice called. "No visual on target," another replied. "Thermal's not picking up anything in the debris field. Sweep the perimeter." He might have made it out. Eli counted at least 4 distinct voices, all using military radio protocol and advanced surveillance equipment. These weren't local hunters hired to cause trouble. These were special operations contractors, probably former military personnel, working for a private security company that asked no questions and left no evidence. Ghost was looking at him with the expectant alertness of a predator awaiting hunting orders. Shadow and Storm had positioned themselves to either flank, their instincts telling them that their territory was under attack and their pack needed to respond accordingly. For 5 years, they'd been raised as family pets who happened to be wolves. Now, in the space of 10 minutes, they'd become what they'd always been genetically programmed to be. Apex predators defending their territory against invaders. Eli activated the night vision scope on his rifle and began scanning the darkness for targets. The thermal imaging equipment the hunters were using would show human body heat clearly, but wolves ran cooler than humans and could be nearly invisible to electronic surveillance. That gave his pack a significant tactical advantage if he was smart enough to use it. "Movement, 3 o'clock, one of the voices called. "Might be wildlife spooked by the explosion. Take the shot if you get a clear target," came the reply. "Instructions are to eliminate any witnesses." Any witnesses. Eli felt ice settle in his stomach as he realized the full scope of what Blackstone Industries had planned. They weren't just trying to remove his wolves, they were trying to eliminate him entirely. The explosion would be blamed on a propane leak. His body would be found in the ruins, and his wolves would be shot as dangerous animals displaced by the tragedy. Clean, simple, and completely deniable. But Blackstone's contractors had made a critical error. They'd assumed that destroying Eli's cabin would break his will to fight. Instead, it had removed the last thing tying him to civilization. For 30 years, he'd been trying to live a peaceful life away from the violence that had defined his military career. Now, with his home destroyed and his family under direct threat, that attempt at peace was over. "Shadow," Eli whispered, using hand signals to communicate his intentions. "Left flank, 200 meters. Wait for my signal." The dark wolf melted into the forest like smoke, moving with the silent precision of a creature that had spent 5 years learning every tree, rock, and game trail on the mountain. These contractors might have night vision and thermal imaging, but they'd never faced an enemy that could navigate by scent through terrain they'd never seen before. "Storm, right flank. Hold position until they commit." The female wolf disappeared into the darkness with the fluid grace of water finding its level, her silver-black coat rendering her nearly invisible, even to enhanced optics. "Ghost, with me. We're going hunting." The big wolf's ears pricked forward, and Eli could see the predatory intelligence in his amber eyes. For 5 years, Ghost had been learning to hunt elk and deer with pack coordination and tactical precision. Tonight, he would discover that the same skills worked equally well on human prey. Eli checked his rifle one final time and began moving toward the voices in the darkness. The contractors were professionals, but they were operating in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy they didn't understand. They thought they were hunting one old hermit with military training. They had no idea they were facing a pack that had been waiting 5 years for someone to threaten their territory. And unlike every other enemy Eli had faced in 20 years of warfare, this pack didn't follow rules of engagement or worry about collateral damage. The war for Copper Ridge had just become a blood feud, and Blackstone Industries was about to learn why you should never corner a wolf pack. Asterisk. The first contractor died without knowing what killed him. Eli watched through his night vision scope as the man moved through the forest with the confident stride of someone who'd never been hunted by a wolf pack. The contractor was using military movement techniques, staying low, checking corners, maintaining radio contact, but he was thinking like a human fighting other humans. He had no conception of an enemy that could track by scent, move in complete silence, and coordinate attacks without electronic communication. Shadow struck from behind, 95 pounds of muscle and fang, hitting the contractor at knee level and dropping him instantly. The man's scream was cut short by jaws that could crack elk bones, and his expensive night vision equipment went dark before he could transmit a warning to his team. Alpha 2, report. A voice crackled over the dead man's radio. Silence. Alpha 2, respond immediately. Eli smiled grimly and keyed the dead contractor's radio. Alpha 2 is unavailable, he said quietly, but I'd be happy to take a message. The response was immediate and professional. All units, we have hostile contact. Target is alive and actively engaging. Switch to combat frequency and maintain operational security. But it was too late for operational security. In the 30 seconds it had taken them to realize they were being hunted, Eli's pack had already moved into position around their remaining positions. These contractors might be professionals, but they were fighting in a wilderness that would swallow armies against an enemy that could see in the dark and strike without warning. Storm's attack came next, hitting the second contractor as he tried to reach higher ground for better radio reception. The female wolf had learned pack hunting from watching Ghost and Shadow coordinate on elk, but she brought her own innovations to the technique. Instead of going for the legs, she hit the man in the chest, using her momentum to drive him backward, off a rocky ledge into a ravine 20 feet below. Contact. We're under attack by... The transmission cut off. In a wet scream that echoed across the valley. Eli was already moving toward the third contractor's position, Ghost flowing through the darkness beside him like a gray shadow. 20 years of combat experience had taught him that the key to winning asymmetric warfare was speed and confusion. Never let the enemy establish defensive positions or coordinate their response. Hit them hard, hit them fast, and disappear before they could adapt. The third contractor was the team leader, judging by his tactical positioning and the sophisticated communication equipment he carried. He'd found cover behind a fallen log and was trying to establish contact with whoever had sent them, his voice tight with the controlled panic of someone realizing his mission had gone catastrophically wrong. Control, this is Hunter 6. We have multiple casualties and are taking heavy fire from unknown hostiles. Request immediate extraction and air support. Eli settled into a sniper position 60 meters away and centered his crosshairs on the man's head. Through his scope, he could see the contractor's face clearly young, competent, probably former military like himself. Under different circumstances, they might have been allies. But this man had come to his mountain to kill his family, and that made him an enemy deserving no mercy. The rifle's report echoed across the valley like thunder, and the contractor's radio went silent permanently. Ghost, Eli whispered. Find the fourth one. The big wolf lifted his head and tested the air. his sensitive nose sorting through the complex scents of gunpowder, blood, and human fear. After a moment, he looked toward a cluster of boulders 200 meters to the north and growled softly. The fourth contractor was the smartest of the group. He'd found defensible terrain and was using his radio to call for backup rather than trying to engage an enemy he couldn't see or understand. But intelligence and caution could only do so much when you were surrounded by predators that had spent 5 years learning every hiding place on the mountain. Control, this is Hunter 4. The entire team is down except for me. I repeat, Hunters 1, 2, and 3 are KIA. Whatever intel you had on this target was wrong. This isn't one old hermit. This is a coordinated defensive operation with multiple shooters and advanced tactics. Eli had to admire the man's professionalism, even as he prepared to kill him. The contractor was trying to save future teams from walking into the same trap, warning his handlers that their intelligence was fatally flawed. Too bad for him that there wouldn't be any future teams. Shadow appeared above the contractor's position like smoke, having used a game trail that wound through the rocks to get behind his defensive position. The Wolf waited for Eli's signal. His amber eyes locked on the target below. Storm emerged from the opposite direction, cutting off the contractor's escape route with the patient precision of a predator that had learned to hunt cooperatively. The man was trapped between 2 wolves and a sniper, but he didn't know it yet. Control, I need immediate extraction. I'm going to try to reach the LZ, but I don't think Eli's signal brought both wolves down on the contractor simultaneously. Shadow hit him from above, while Storm struck from the side, and the man's final radio transmission dissolved into screams that faded quickly in the vast silence of the wilderness. Silence settled over the valley like a blanket, broken only by the distant crackling of the burning cabin and the soft patting of paws on stone as Eli's wolves returned to his position. 4 professional killers had entered their territory with the intention of murdering their pack leader and destroying their home. Now 4 professional killers were feeding the ravens and coyotes, their expensive equipment scattered across the mountain like broken toys. But Eli felt no satisfaction in the victory. These contractors were just the opening move in a larger game, and their deaths would bring consequences that would test his pack's survival skills in ways they'd never faced before. Ghost returned first, his muzzle dark with blood that wasn't his own. The big wolf pressed against Eli's leg with the confident affection of a predator that had successfully defended his territory, but his ears remained alert for new threats. Shadow and Storm appeared moments later, their body language reflecting the heightened awareness that came after combat. Eli gathered the contractors' RDIO equipment and began monitoring their communication frequencies. Within minutes, he heard what he'd been expecting: multiple aircraft converging on his mountain, ground teams being mobilized, and a corporate damage control operation swinging into high gear. Hunter team is dark, a new voice reported. No radio. Contact for 30 minutes. Initiating contingency protocol. Roger that. Cleanup teams are en route. ETA 20 minutes. Medical standing by at LZ Beta. Negative on medical. This is a body recovery operation now. Eli smiled grimly as he listened to the corporate machinery adapting to the loss of their assassination team. They'd expected a quick, clean operation. Kill the hermit, burn the evidence, and report a tragic accident. Instead, they'd lost 4 trained operators and gained a problem that couldn't be solved with money or legal pressure. But they were also escalating rapidly. The aircraft he could hear approaching weren't helicopters. They were fixed-wing planes that could carry larger teams and heavier equipment. Blackstone Industries was moving from assassination to military-style assault, and Eli's pack would need every advantage they could find to survive what was coming. He led his wolves away from the immediate area, using game trails and natural cover to avoid the thermal imaging equipment he knew the incoming teams would be carrying. His cabin was gone, along with most of his survival supplies and all of his military equipment except what he grabbed during the escape. They were now fugitives in their own territory, hunted by an enemy with unlimited resources and no concern for legal constraints. But they were also apex predators fighting on their home ground. With 30 years of wilderness experience and 5 years of pack coordination on their side, the corporate executives in their climate-controlled offices had no idea what they'd unleashed by threatening a wolf pack's territory. They thought they were dealing with a public relations problem that could be solved with violence. They were about to discover they'd started a war with an enemy that didn't recognize surrender, negotiate defeat, or leave survivors who could testify against them. As the sound of approaching aircraft grew louder, Eli found a concealed position in a natural cave system he discovered years earlier. His wolves settled around him with the patient alertness of creatures preparing for a siege, their amber eyes reflecting the distant glow of his burning home. "This isn't over," Eli murmured, scratching behind Ghost's ears as the big wolf leaned against him. "They came to our mountain. They burned our home. They threatened our pack. Now they're going to learn what happens when you declare war on a family that's been preparing for this fight for 5 years. The sound of helicopters filled the valley as corporate cleanup teams arrived to sanitize the scene and prepare for the next phase of their operation. But deep in the cave system that had sheltered his ancestors for thousands of years, Eli Hargrove was no longer thinking like a hermit trying to protect his peaceful life. He was thinking like a special forces operator planning the total destruction of an enemy that had made the fatal mistake of attacking his family. And this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. He'd be fighting with 3 wolves who understood loyalty, territory, and revenge better than any human ever could. The corporate war against Copper Ridge was about to become very personal and very deadly. Dawn brought helicopters and the harsh mechanical sound of a military operation in full deployment. From his concealed position in the cave system, Eli counted 6 aircraft, 2 transport choppers, 2 gunships, and 2 smaller reconnaissance birds that circled the valley like mechanical vultures. The corporate cleanup had become a corporate invasion, and his mountain was now a battlefield. Through binoculars taken from one of the dead contractors, he watched armed teams fast rope from the transport helicopters onto the smoking ruins of his cabin. Professional soldiers in tactical gear, moving with the coordinated precision of a unit that had done this kind of work many times before. Not corporate security guards or local law enforcement. These were military contractors who specialized in situations that couldn't be handled through legal channels. Ghost lay beside him, the big wolf's amber eyes fixed on the invaders below with the unwavering focus of a predator studying prey. Shadow and Storm flanked them in the cave mouth, their body language tense but controlled. They could sense their pack leader's heightened alertness, and they were ready to follow his lead into whatever came next. The tactical radio Eli had taken from the dead team leader crackled with professional communication. "Base, this is Strike. Team Alpha, we have 4 KIA at the primary location. Cause of death appears to be animal attack, but the placement suggests coordinated assault." "Copy, Alpha. What's your assessment of the target?" "Target is definitely alive and operating with unknown assets. The defensive positions and attack patterns indicate military training and local knowledge. We're dealing with a professional, not a civilian hermit." Eli smiled grimly at the admission. It had taken them 4 dead contractors to realize they weren't hunting an easy target. But they were still thinking in conventional terms, military versus military, professional versus professional. They had no conception of an enemy that included 3 apex predators who could move through terrain that would stop human soldiers and strike without the limitations of human rules of engagement. "Alpha, proceed with Phase 2. Establish a perimeter and begin systematic clearing operations. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. Anything that moves is a target. Roger that, base. Be advised, we have local wildlife activity. Multiple large predators in the area. Eliminate any animals that pose a threat to the operation. Authorized to use any necessary force. The casual order to kill his wolves sent ice through Eli's veins. These weren't soldiers following legitimate military orders. These were hired killers operating without oversight or accountability. They would murder Ghost, Shadow, and Storm as casually as they'd murdered the assassination team's original target, then report it as necessary force protection. But they'd made a critical tactical error by revealing their intentions over an unsecured radio frequency. Now Eli knew exactly what they planned to do, and he could plan accordingly. He led his wolves deeper into the cave system. Following passages he'd explored over 30 years of living on the mountain. The caves connected to a network of natural tunnels that emerged at different points across the valley, offering concealed movement routes that no satellite or thermal imaging could detect. His pack would become ghosts, striking without warning and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The radio chatter continued as the corporate soldiers established their perimeter and began sweeping the valley in organized search patterns. Professional work, but hampered by their reliance on technology and conventional tactics. They were scanning for human heat signatures and electronic communications, not for predators that hunted by scent and coordinated through body language. Bravo. Team, move to grid coordinates 4 to 7 Alpha. Charlie Team, take the ridgeline and establish overwatch. Contact! Contact! We have eyes on a large canine, approximately 100 meters northeast of the cabin site. Eli's blood ran cold as he realized one of the teams had spotted Shadow, who must have been scouting their positions from concealed observation points. The dark wolf was invisible to human eyes in most terrain, but military-grade thermal imaging could pick up his body heat against the cold mountain rock. Take the shot, Bravo 2, clear to engage. The rifle shot echoed across the valley like thunder, followed immediately by Shadow's pain-filled howl. Eli's tactical mind processed the sound automatically wounded, but not killed, probably a grazing shot that had caught the wolf while he was moving between cover positions. Ghost's response was immediate and terrifying. The big wolf erupted from the cave mouth with a roar that seemed to shake the mountain itself, his massive form flowing down the rocky slope toward the soldiers below like a gray avalanche. Storm followed instantly, a smaller form matching Ghost's speed as they closed the distance to the team that had hurt their packmate. Jesus Christ. We have multiple large animals inbound, moving fast. Open fire. All units. We are under attack by... The transmission cut off in screams and gunfire as 215 pounds of enraged wolf pack hit the corporate soldiers with the coordinated fury of predators defending their injured family member. Eli heard automatic weapons firing in controlled bursts, then wild full auto panic. Then the wet sounds of fangs finding flesh. Silence settled over the radio frequency, broken only by the distant echoes of gunfire from other teams responding to the contact. Phase 2 of the corporate operation had just become a feeding frenzy, and the tactical advantage was shifting rapidly toward the predators, who knew this terrain better than any human ever could. But Shadow was wounded somewhere in the chaos below, and Eli's pack was now scattered across a battlefield filled with professional killers who had been given permission to shoot anything that moved. The climax of their war for Copper Ridge had begun, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Eli found Shadow in a rocky crevice 300 meters from where the gunfight had erupted. The dark wolf's left shoulder torn by a high-velocity round that had carved a deep furrow through muscle and fur. The wound was serious, but not fatal. Shadow could still move, though his mobility was compromised. More importantly, his amber eyes still held the fierce intelligence that made him such an effective pack member. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, examining the wound with hands that remembered field medical training from 20 years ago. You're going to be fine. But you need to stay hidden while Ghost and I finish this. Shadow whined softly and tried to rise, his instincts telling him to rejoin the fight despite his injury. But Eli's hand on his neck kept him down, the pack hierarchy asserting itself even in the chaos of combat. The wounded wolf settled reluctantly, understanding that his pack leader's orders took precedence over his desire for revenge. The tactical radio crackled with increasingly desperate reports from the surviving corporate soldiers. Base, this is Charlie team. Bravo team is down. Repeat. Bravo team is not responding. We have multiple KIA and are taking heavy casualties from unknown hostiles. Charlie, this is base. What is your tactical assessment? Sir, we're not fighting humans. These are large predators, possibly wolves, operating with coordinated pack tactics. They're using the terrain to conduct hit-and-run attacks, then disappearing before we can acquire targets. Negative, Charlie. Your mission parameters haven't changed. Eliminate all threats and secure the area. Eli smiled grimly as he listened to the corporate commander's refusal to acknowledge the reality of what his soldiers were facing. The man was probably sitting in a climate-controlled command center 3 states away, staring at computer screens that showed tactical positions but couldn't convey the primal terror of being hunted by apex predators in their own territory. Ghosts. Howl echoed across the valley, not the pain-filled cry that Shadow had made when wounded, but the deep, resonant call of an alpha wolf rallying his pack for a coordinated assault. Storm answered immediately from a different position, her higher-pitched voice adding a note of wild fury to the communication. Jesus, they're calling to each other. One of the corporate soldiers whispered over the radio. They're organizing for another attack. All teams, establish defensive positions and maintain overlapping fields of fire. Use thermal imaging to track movement and engage any heat signatures that aren't human. But thermal imaging was useless against predators that could use natural cover to mask their heat signatures and approach from downwind, through terrain that would challenge mountain goats. Ghost and Storm had spent 5 years learning every hidden approach to every position on the mountain, and they were using that knowledge with the tactical precision of special operations soldiers. The next attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Ghost hit the main body of Charlie team from above, using a natural rock slide to mask his approach until he was close enough to strike. Storm flanked them from the left, her smaller size allowing her to move through terrain the larger wolf couldn't navigate. And Eli provided sniper fire from a concealed position 600 meters away, his rifle picking off targets who were focused on the immediate threat of the wolves. The corporate soldiers were professionals, but they were fighting an enemy that combined human intelligence with predatory instincts that had been refined by millions of years of evolution. When Ghost's massive form erupted from behind a boulder 30 feet away, their training told them to engage with controlled fire and tactical movement. Their survival instincts told them to run screaming into the forest. The conflicting responses created fatal hesitation. In the seconds it took the soldiers to choose between training and terror, Ghost was among them, with the fluid grace of water finding its level. Storm hit them from the flank while they were focused on the larger threat, and Eli's rifle eliminated anyone who tried to establish decisive fire. Within 90 seconds, Charlie team had been reduced from 8 professional soldiers to scattered body parts feeding the ravens. The corporate invasion of Copper Ridge was collapsing into a massacre, and the surviving teams were beginning to understand that they were facing something outside their experience or training. Base, this is Alpha Team. Charlie and Bravo are down. I repeat, we have lost contact with 2 full teams, requesting immediate extraction and air support. Negative, Alpha. Complete your mission. Sir, with respect, we need to abort this operation. We're taking casualties from an enemy we can't identify or engage effectively. Alpha Team, you have your orders. Eliminate the target and secure the area. Eli could hear the desperation in the team leader's voice as he realized his corporate handlers were willing to sacrifice every soldier on the mountain rather than admit their operation had failed. But he could also hear something else, the sound of helicopter rotors growing louder as the gunships moved into attack positions. The corporate executives had decided that if their ground teams couldn't handle 3 wolves and 1 hermit, they'd solve the problem with air-to-ground missiles and heavy machine guns. They were about to turn his mountain into a free fire zone, and anyone or anything caught in the open would be destroyed. Ghost and Storm were still hunting the remaining ground teams, unaware that death was approaching from above on rotor blades and high explosives. Eli had perhaps minutes to warn his pack and find cover before the gunships turned their family into scattered atoms across the wilderness they'd called home. Asterisk. The helicopter gunships never fired a shot as the corporate aircraft moved into attack position, engines screaming across the valley like mechanical banshees. Sergeant Martinez and 3 FBI agents appeared on the mountain road below. Their vehicles climbed the grade with the steady persistence of law enforcement officers who'd finally gathered enough evidence to act, and their radio transmissions cut through the corporate frequency like a blade through silk. Mrs. Federal Agent Sarah Chun, FBI. All aircraft are ordered to withdraw immediately. This area is now under federal investigation for multiple violations of federal law. Negative, federal agents, came the reply from the lead gunship. This is a private security operation conducted under legitimate authority. Stand down immediately or face federal charges for interfering with an ongoing investigation. Eli listened to the exchange with grim satisfaction as he helped Shadow limp toward the cave system where they could wait out whatever was about to happen. The corporate executives at Blackstone Industries had made a fatal error. They'd escalated their private war into a federal crime scene, and their hired killers were about to become evidence in a case that would destroy everyone involved. Ghost and Storm emerged from the forest like gray shadows, their muzzles dark with blood, but their eyes bright with the satisfaction of successful hunters. They'd eliminated the remaining ground teams with the methodical efficiency of predators who'd learned that cooperation was the key to survival. Now they flanked Eli and Shadow as their pack leader led them to safety, their amber eyes scanning the sky for new threats. "Base, this is Hawk 1, the gunship pilot reported. "We have federal agents on site and are being ordered to withdraw. Proceed with the mission, Hawk 1. You have authorization to complete your objectives." "Sir, that's a negative. I'm not firing on a federal crime scene. We're withdrawing to base." The sound of helicopter rotors began to fade as the corporate aircraft retreated, leaving behind a mountain littered with the evidence of their illegal operation. Eli could see Martinez and the FBI agents moving up the road, probably following GPS coordinates provided by the same satellite surveillance that had guided the corporate assault teams within an hour. The valley was filled with federal investigators, crime scene technicians, and enough law enforcement personnel to secure a small city. From his concealed position, Eli watched them catalog the destruction, the burned cabin, the scattered bodies of the corporate soldiers, the high-tech equipment that had been abandoned when the operation collapsed. Agent Chun was a small woman, with the intense focus of someone who'd spent years building cases against people who thought they were above the law. She moved through the crime scene with practiced efficiency, documenting evidence and coordinating with other agencies, while Martinez provided tactical support and local knowledge. "Sergeant," she called to Martinez as he examined the remains of one of the corporate soldiers. "What's your assessment of what happened here?" "Professional military operation gone wrong," Martinez replied. "Multiple teams, advanced equipment, coordinated assault. But they were fighting someone who knew the terrain better and had assets they didn't account for." "What kind of assets?" Martinez gestured toward the massive paw prints clearly visible in the soft earth around the bodies. "Wolfpack. 3 adults. Probably been living here for years. When the shooting started, they defended their territory the way wolves have been doing for 10,000 years. Agent Chun photographed the paw prints with the careful attention of someone who understood that every detail would be scrutinized in court. Where's Hargrove? If he's smart, he's somewhere safe with his wolves, waiting for this to sort itself out, Martinez said. Man's former special forces, and he's been living on this mountain for 30 years. He'll surface when he's ready. If summoned by the conversation, Eli emerged from the tree line with Ghost at his side, his hands clearly visible and his posture non-threatening. He'd left Shadow and Storm in the cave system, where they'd be safe from any remaining corporate threats. But Ghost had insisted on accompanying his pack leader to meet with the federal authorities. Agent Chun? Eli called as he approached the crime scene. I'm Eli Hargrove. I believe you have some questions for me. The FBI agent turned to study him with intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing, the way he moved, the confidence in his voice, the massive wolf that stayed at his side without restraint or aggression. Mr. Hargrove, we're investigating multiple homicides and what appears to be a coordinated assault on your property. Can you tell us what happened here? Corporate assassination team tried to kill me and my wolves, Eli replied simply. They burned my home, wounded one of my family members, and declared war on my territory. We defended ourselves according to the rules of engagement they established. Your family members? Eli scratched behind Ghost's ears, and the big wolf leaned against his leg with obvious affection. 3 wolves I've raised from pups. They're not pets or captive animals. They're family members who chose to stay with me instead of joining wild packs. Agent Chan photographed Ghost from multiple angles, documenting his obvious health and non-aggressive behavior. Mr. Hargrove, we have evidence that Blackstone Industries hired private military contractors to eliminate what they considered obstacles to their mining operation. You and your wolves were targeted for assassination because you refused to sell your property. That sounds about right, Eli agreed. Question is, what are you going to do about it? 6 months later, Eli stood on the porch of his new cabin, larger and more comfortable than the original, built with insurance money and compensation from the federal lawsuit that had destroyed Blackstone Industries. The corporation had been disbanded. Its executives were facing federal charges for conspiracy and murder, and the mining rights they'd purchased had been revoked by court order. Ghost, Shadow, and Storm lounged in the afternoon sunshine, their family intact and their territory secure once again. Shadow's shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar hidden beneath his thick fur. Storm had grown more protective after the attack, staying closer to the cabin and watching the approaches with the vigilant attention of a predator who'd learned that their peaceful world could be shattered without warning. But the mountains were quiet again, filled with the natural sounds of wind and wildlife rather than the mechanical noise of corporate machinery. The wilderness they'd fought to defend was protected now by federal designation as a wildlife preserve, ensuring that no future corporation could threaten their home. Sometimes the family you choose finds you when you need it most. Sometimes that family howls at the moon and teaches you that loyalty is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And sometimes, when the world tries to destroy what you love, you discover that the bonds between packmates are stronger than any force that money and power can buy. Eli Hargrove had come to these mountains, seeking solitude, and found something far more valuable: a family that would stand with him against any threat, and the knowledge that some things in life were worth defending with everything you had. The wolves were home, and they were staying.